Welcome to the return of the Hudson Area Public Library's Voices in the Valley series. I'm librarian Camille Young. It's been nearly a year since our last event, and we are thrilled to be back at Hop and Barrel for conversations about life in the Valley. Thanks to our partners in this event, the Hudson Area Library Foundation, Hop and Barrel, and Addison Filiatro. We've heard from many voices in the past 2 years: senior citizens, Black neighbors, Asian neighbors, Hispanic neighbors, ministers, police officers, voices of neighbors with disabilities, and voices from our neighbors in the LGBTQ plus community. Tonight, we're featuring voices of caregivers. If you have any questions, please write them down and hand them to Matt, or leave them at your table. Matt will come and collect them. So on our panel tonight, we have Kerry Reis. She retired from Securian Financial in 2016. She's an active community volunteer, including the YMCA Community Board, Hudson Daybreak Rotary, serving on the Environmental Committee, the Hudson Area Library Foundation, and she is a St. Croix County court-appointed special advocate. She'll speak about her experience as part of the sandwich generation of caregivers. Next, we have Tara Murdzek. She is the Caregiver Support Coordinator for the Aging and Disability Resource Center of St. Croix County. Her role at the center is to offer education, support, and resources to those caring for a loved one age 60 and over, or those caring for a loved one with dementia at any age. Next up, we have Roberta Sosof-Esquina. She's the mother of a medically complex 7-year-old boy who has multiple medical issues, including spastic quadriplegia cerebral palsy. Roberta took a hiatus from her career to be a full-time caregiver as he needs awake and alert caregiving at all times. Lastly on the panel, we have Shelley Tougas. She is the director of the Hudson Area Public Library and a member of Rotary, Kiwanis, and the Golden Rule Initiative. In 2021, she became a caregiver when her mother was diagnosed with stage 4 small cell lung cancer. So to start off, first, a point of clarification. Tara, your job includes support for people caring for a loved one with dementia. Can you explain the difference between a dementia diagnosis and Alzheimer's?
Yes, dementia is essentially the umbrella term for any type of progressive, irreversible memory loss. So Alzheimer's is just a type of dementia. There's over 100 different types of dementia. Alzheimer's is just the most common that we hear about.
Thank you. So to start us off, can you tell us how your caregiving journey began? And for Tara, why did you choose this career path?
Should I start? Well, I guess I don't wake up in the morning and think of myself as a caregiver. Instead, the title I'd give myself is daughter, mother, grandmother. And the reason I said I'm in the sandwich generation is I right now provide some daycare to my soon-to-be 3-year-old grandson. That started at the beginning of COVID. He was born April 2nd, 2020, at a time of great uncertainty, and I and the other grandmother kind of stepped in. So I do provide that, but the primary focus that I'll have today has to do with my role as daughter. I'm the oldest of 7, and that means I have a lot of siblings that are extremely helpful. And my parents at the time, a couple of years ago, were living in northern Wisconsin, living their dream. They, in particular my dad, wanted to retire up north. And they had a beautiful lake property, like a lot of people around here. But his health was in decline. And so for a couple of years, it was stepping in to make sure that they got to appointments and could drive to appointments, which were ranged from St. Croix Falls and Webster to Minong to Duluth to Hayward, and all points in between. And so that was one of the roles I and some of my siblings played. Things accelerated a bit as my dad had congestive heart failure and didn't know it. He was treating the symptoms, but he really wasn't getting good medical care. So about, this summer it'll be 2 years ago, we kind of did an intervention. And I'm forever grateful to my sister, Kelly, who stepped in and said, enough of this. The catalyst for them to move was not maybe of their choosing, but the fact of the matter is my mother could no longer physically care for my dad. And so that started the caregiving / intervention journey.
And the reason I got in, well, I'm a geriatric social worker. Part of my interest in geriatrics and social work was my grandparents were a huge part of my upbringing, and I just, as they aged, I found myself helping them more, and I was just drawn to the profession, and I feel lucky to be able to do this job.
And I became a caregiver the day that my son was born. My pregnancy was normal, it was healthy, there was no indication that anything was wrong. However, the labor was very traumatic and difficult. I was in labor for 23 hours before the doctor decided to go ahead with an emergency C-section. By then, my son had already sustained a brain injury. A few days after he was born, he was transferred to the NICU, and as he was growing, I knew that something was terribly wrong. When he was 5 months old, he was diagnosed with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. It's the most severe form of epilepsy, which is a seizure disorder characterized by very numerous seizures every day that are very hard to treat. And when he was 1 year old, he was diagnosed with spastic quadriplegia cerebral palsy, which is the most severe form of cerebral palsy. At the age of 2, he stopped breathing, and we had to give him a tracheostomy so he could breathe. And at that time, he also got a GJ tube so he could get the nutrition that he would need. And then throughout the years, we've had to do other procedures and surgeries to give him the best quality of life that we could possibly give him. And I'm happy to say that he is a thriving 8-year-old now. He just celebrated 8 years. Every day is a challenge. I had to give up my career because it is awake and alert caregiving 24/7, and it's hard, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, as we go along in the panel. But that's how my caregiving journey began, the birth of my son. And I have to add that I knew that he was going to be special before he was even born, and that's why I named him Noah Emmanuel before he was even born.
So for me, it was my mother who was sick. She quit smoking in the fall of 2020, and 6 months later, April 1st, April Fool's Day, she had a seizure. And she was at her winter home in Nevada with my dad, and they had to take her in a helicopter to Las Vegas, a hospital there, and try to figure out what had happened. And I flew out with my sister. You know, it was a seizure. Then we thought there was something, maybe a tumor in her brain, and ultimately we found out it was small cell lung cancer, which is a very aggressive cancer. And she already had it in her lungs, her bones, her liver, and her colon. But this is a cancer that responds well to chemo. It knocks it out, but it has a way of hiding. And so within 6 months, 8 months, maybe a year, it bounces back. So what we were hoping for was a long remission. We had to get her home and, start the process of figuring out what to do. She lived for 4 months, and during that time, I got to play, which I consider a privilege now, a primary role in taking care of her and getting her to appointments. I knew it was going to be short from the beginning, so I tried to look at it as, an opportunity to spend as much time with her as possible and taking care of her, the way she had taken care of me my whole life. So I do feel like it was a privilege to be able to do that for her. Kind of enormous personal toll, as everybody here will talk about, I'm sure. But, it was every moment we worked really hard to be present. And I think that's sort of the gift that came from it.
Well, once again, thank you all for being here and sharing your personal lives with us. As we work our way through the questions, Tara, we'll just ask you to tell us what you've seen and heard from caregivers that you support or any related information that you might have. So how has caregiving impacted your career or social life?
Well, I might have the least effect of all of you because I retired in 2016. While I continue to do contract work, I didn't have to be so concerned about career. So the biggest effect that it's probably had is my calendar gets pretty full of current and future appointments. I'm getting texts and emails from now my mother's provider, care providers, or I should say doctors and resources. I wind up canceling at the last minute a lot of times, and fortunately, groups are pretty understanding about that. We have to be a little louder. So my friends are used to me group texting if I can't come to a book club or some other event because of a caregiving need that takes priority.
I have the opposite problem. I'm usually too loud. So what I see a lot with the caregivers that I work with is their world becomes very small. They are doing less and less of the things for themselves or even their own appointments. They're not with their social group. They become socially isolated. And so that's really difficult for them because now their support system, when they need it the most, is even smaller just because of the nature of caregiving. And I just wanted to say, too, when part of what I like to do is remind people that they are caregivers because so many people don't identify as caregivers. And when you said you see yourself as a daughter, I like to get that message out there because if you don't identify as a caregiver, then you're not reaching out for all the resources that are available. So.
As I had mentioned before, I had a very flourishing career, but I decided to leave that to take care of my son full-time because it was just too difficult to work full-time. And while my job was very flexible, it was getting to be too much to be able to take him to his therapy appointments. And that involves PT, OT, speech, as well as all of his specialty appointments, which are all out of the Twin Cities because there are no specialty doctors in the area. And so while it was very difficult for me to leave that career, I didn't feel like I had a choice because my son and my mental health were more important. And so I've been doing full-time caregiving for the past few years. My social life, it's challenging because my son is so medically fragile. I have to be careful to not get him sick because any mild illness could send him to the PICU. And it's very dangerous for him. I have to revolve any social interactions I have, like if I have other caregivers to take care of him. So it's often limited to who do I have at home that I trust to take care of him so I could leave to have interactions with other people without him with me.
As the director and having done this, I should have warned everybody that every now and then there's like, I don't know if they're like grinding beans or something in the back room, but that thing will go off, and sorry about that. It doesn't last long. Also, you're welcome to come sit up closer too if you're having a hard time hearing. Please feel free to do that. Okay, so social life. It was the pandemic, and I was interim director at the library and taking 12 graduate school credits. So I did not have a social life already. So that didn't have an effect. But it was very hard, of course, to juggle. My daughter had also just been diagnosed with a chronic health condition like 3 months before. So there was definitely a lot going on. And socially, the one thing that was interesting is my aunt and my cousins who lived in Colorado for 40 years, the year before just moved back to this area. So they we could all spend holidays and birthdays and things together again. So we had one Christmas where we were all back together and my mom was there. And that was wonderful, but it was just one. And I mean, we're all glad that they moved back when they did, but sometimes it makes you think that you can't wait to make some of those important decisions because you just don't know what's going to happen. The career aspect, you know, we were open and closed, and thankfully I have a lot of flexibility in my job since I don't do front-facing desk work. I took my work laptop and went to chemo with my mom because she could only have one person, and this was kind of a big challenge. It was the pandemic, and they only let the patient have one person at an appointment. And my sister had just started a new job. She didn't have time off. And my mom said, it's not going to be your father. So that left me. And I was really glad to be able to take that role because I'm a lot more assertive and ask a lot of questions. And that's what my mom needed at the time. So I feel really fortunate that I have such a great group of people at the library who didn't need me on site 24/7. They didn't need me there 40 hours a week. They just managed and ran the shop. And I had an assistant director at that time, and we were quite a duo. And we tried to take care of each other when things like that were happening. So I was able to keep working, keep going to school. My professors were great. They gave me extended due dates and things like that. And, you know, I could have taken a lot of time off through FMLA. It just went by so fast, and it feels like a blur. And I was able to get it all done because I think when you see a sprint, you get energized and you can do it. If you see a marathon, it's a different story. And I knew my mom, you know, only had a couple of months if we were lucky. So you know, you just make it all work. And sometimes you don't know how you did it, but it all worked out. And we had some really wonderful times together, those drives to doctor's appointments and the time in the waiting room. I mean, we made the most of every one of those visits.
So I think it's pretty clear that being a caregiver is all-consuming. So let's talk about self-care. How does this affect your physical and mental health? How do you recharge and take care of yourself?
I'm pretty fortunate because I mentioned earlier I'm the oldest of 7, and I'm not afraid to delegate. and to my other siblings, and most of us live in the area. So from time to time, I'll be assertive and say, boy, it'd really be great if someone could take mom to X, Y, or Z. And I think I need to be clear. My dad passed away in November of 2021. It was after 3 months after we did what I refer to as the intervention. But my mother had health issues too. And so, the doctor's appointments for both of them could be consuming, but a lot of my siblings stepped in. We did find that it was really important that we all speak with the same voice to each other. And we also found that my mother is quite hard of hearing, and at the time, her hearing aids weren't working. So we always would ask for instructions in writing, because my dad was only half hearing the negative news, and my mother wasn't hearing anything. And so it was really important for us to go back and share that amongst us, and some of our group texts were about those kinds of things. As far as self-care, I try really hard to get to the why frequently, and I just check in with myself, and if I need a little rest or just to unplug, I let myself do that.
And I'm glad you made that point about delegation. That's part of what I talk about to caregivers is, you know, people sometimes don't know what to do. They want to help, so give them something to do. So that's really important to let those people that are wanting to help you know what it exactly is you want them to do. And another thing that I like to share is self-care is not selfish, because if you don't take care of yourself, obviously, you cannot take care of somebody else. And caregivers can get so overwhelmed that they're almost frozen and they don't even know what to ask, or reaching out to help just seems exhausting. And so it's really important just to even take those baby steps, and even if it's an hour to yourself to take a nap or to journal, whatever that looks like for that caregiver for self-care. It could be exercise, like you said. It could be listening to music. It's just that time to try to rejuvenate themselves.
My career before I became a stay-at-home mom / caregiver was in mental health counseling. And so self-care has always been very important to me. It took me a long time to realize what self-care really is, though, and I think as moms in general, we often confuse self-care and hygiene. And so a lot of people are like, well, for self-care, take a shower. But that's not self-care. And I was taking a lot of showers and I wasn't feeling any better. And so I had to dig really deep within myself, and I had to admit that I needed help. The counselor needed counseling, and that was my self-care. I needed somebody to talk to, and to really let out all of these really difficult and challenging emotions that I was feeling. The deepest, darkest moments of my life were not being resolved by taking a shower or a bubble bath. The other thing that's really helped me in my self-care journey, and I know that it's really challenging for a lot of people, and I'm empathetic to this because a lot of people have been hurt by the church, is my relationship with God, my spiritual well-being is so tied up in how well I am doing as a caregiver. And so that has also been really important for me to be able to tap into my relationship with God and tap into the scripture. And like I said, I know that's difficult for a lot of people, and I'm empathetic to that. But that's my personal experience, and it's taken a long time to get to that point. There were a lot of times where I just was very angry at God. I didn't understand why. Why would a loving God allow this to happen to my child? My child's suffering is not the act of a loving God, but it took me a long time to realize that that isn't God. The world is just a broken place. But ultimately, when I realized that God is love, then I was able to love myself and find self-care through that.
I didn't really think about self-care because I knew that period of time was going to be really short. And I ate potato chips for lunch in my car while I was driving, and a Quick Trip muffin in my car while I was driving for breakfast, and a slice of Quick Trip pizza for dinner in my car while I was driving. And was in the beginning of a new relationship, and that person was an incredible source of support. And I think that's the one thing that I was able to do, was to identify when somebody could help me with something and ask them to do it. And that was a new thing for me. I'm not very good at doing that. So reaching out and asking people to step up and do this or that, or can you visit my mom, or I need somebody to run errands with my daughter. And that really helped a lot. And, you feel the compassion of the people around you when you ask them to do something for you during a time like that, and they respond with such generosity. That is, like, if you have to pick out a few nuggets of things that are good about such a terrible experience, those are the nuggets, those people who would step up and do those things for you. And then I just worried about, like, there will be time for self-care later. I probably couldn't have done that for a very long period of time, but it worked for me during those 4 months.
So it was kind of touched on, but how do you deal with feelings that are negative but normal, such as like resentment or frustration?
I think I let myself be depressed and grieve when my dad died. I was with him the day he died, and I was the only sibling with him because of COVID protocols. My mom couldn't come with us. And ironically, it was at the clinic where he would have gotten his heart dealt with. So if you're going to have a heart event, you want it to be at the clinic where there are experts. So I got to spend those last minutes with him, and those last conversations were extraordinarily sweet. He did not know that was his last day. All of he was reflecting on was how he was looking forward to going to his second religion, which is deer hunting, and hopefully getting better so that he could do that one more time. But I knew I was going to be sad. All of my siblings, we all were sad. I just had a tougher time than other people, and I just would say, I'm sorry, I'm just really grieving. I just don't feel like doing this, and just let myself be. I did take a little trip to visit a girlfriend in Florida, and being in the sunshine did help me. But I would say that was, kind of the main thing. I still feel it. Grieving is hard work. It's not for the faint of heart. How about that?
When I talk with caregivers, I facilitate 2 caregiver support groups, and guilt is a big part of that because they do at times obviously feel frustrated or angry, but I remind them they're only human, and those are natural feelings, and it's essentially, you feel that way, but what are you doing about it? And that's when I just encourage them to, if, reach out to your mental health professional, or obviously continue coming to support group if that's what works for you, or talk to a close friend, whatever it is that looks like at that moment, or even walking into another room, catching your breath, and coming back out. Being a caregiver is exhausting, and that exhaustion can lead to just frustration, even though they love the person they're caring for and they're doing their best. I think it comes with the territory.
I can give a recent example of when I was extremely frustrated. My son's wheelchair broke, and I was alone, and it's his only way to be mobile. And it was me in the wheelchair, and we were wrestling for about an hour, and I finally decided to give up, and I just sat there and I cried for about an hour, bitter tears, and then I talked to a girlfriend, and then I went back at it the next day, and I was able to fix it within the next 5 minutes. I think it's really important when we have those moments of frustration or anger or bitterness to allow yourself to feel those, but not to dwell in it, especially as a parent of a special needs child. We're in this for the long haul. My son is 8 years old now. I never imagined that he would be 8. It's hard to think into the future because I'm not sure what the future holds. But if I were to live in that anger and frustration and bitterness, my quality of life wouldn't be very good, and neither would my child's, neither would my daughter. She's 12, and she's also a member of the family and is a witness to everything that's happening. And since I'm here on this platform, I want other special needs parents to know that you are not alone. I think that oftentimes when we think of caregivers, we think of adults taking care of aging parents, but there are so many parents taking care of small children who have special needs, significant special needs. And it's harder to find you guys because there's so many rules, like privacy laws, HIPAA. It's hard to find you guys, but I want you to know that you're not alone. I see you. It's frustrating, it's hard, but there's so many amazing things. I've met so many amazing people, and yeah.
So I got very frustrated. Mostly my family we were pretty solid together and on the same page, but every now and then there would be like questions of the decisions that we had made, as a family, and my mom had made. And people have their like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, right? Stress reactions. Mine is only fight. I don't have flight. I don't have fawn. I don't have freeze. I just have fight. And so I have to say that there was a lot of like tongue biting and resisting comments and discussions that could create long-term wedges. But, I had literally gone to online oncology cancer research conferences and watched the doctors talk about small cell lung cancer. We really studied, we really knew a lot, and we talked to doctors and we took their advice. And so sometimes when you would get like question from somebody who maybe had read a sentence about small cell lung cancer, I would just get infuriated because those decisions. My mom decided to quit treatment primarily is the thing that came up. She had a really horrible reaction to her chemo. Ultimately, the doctors were like, the chemo will kill her faster than the cancer. So you have to have some conversations about quality of life and what does she want her last weeks and months to be like. And we did. And the priest who visited with her was fantastic because he just said, Karen, it's going to be you and me in this room. Everybody is leaving. And the two of them had a talk. And when he left, she let everybody know what she wanted. She was very strong in her position. There was no more wavering or, oh, what's this person going to think? I don't want to let them down by not trying more chemo. So to have that presence for her was fantastic. I think the other big frustration, and anybody who's ever dealt with a medical problem will talk to you about the insurance, Medicare issues, and problems with doctors and nurses and communication. I mean, they're good. They're all trying to do their job. But I'll tell you, for us, the best resource was the home health nurse. Doctors, yep, they did their job. They know what they're doing. But like, this was the person who had insights based on her experience, plus knew all kinds of like resources. And there's a group that called Rhino in River Falls, and they do things for people who are dealing with stuff like this. Like if your washing machine breaks, this group's going to come in and buy you a washing machine. No documentation, no eligibility. I mean, just like all these little nooks and crannies supports that you wouldn't know are out there. So that was incredible. And she clued us in early on about pain and pain issues and pain management, and the route that methadone would offer. She knew more than like the pain management doctor. I'm not kidding. And if it hadn't been for her, my mother probably would have suffered quite a bit. And so I feel like the bile coming up just as I talk about some of this, and trying to get doctors to answer a phone call, return a message, get a new prescription in on time, and then getting the pharmacy to fill the darn thing, and all those kinds of complications that they just add up in a big way when you're dealing with a big health issue, as I think all of you are nodding your heads. And there are so many examples, I won't even get into them, but that alone can wear you down, because fighting it all the time, the energy that takes is incredible. So having resources, thank you for being here to talk about that, because that was incredible. It just helped us so much to have a few people who knew some shortcuts.
Working with Shelley, I can confirm she is a fighter. So we've touched a little bit on doctor appointments and insurance, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to go into more detail about what doctor's appointments are like for caregivers, how difficult insurance can be. It's difficult even when you go in for something really simple, so I can't imagine what it's like for caregivers.
Well, I'll speak to my experience with both my father and my mother. So my father largely was immobile towards the end. It took all of his oxygen in his body just to get in and out of the passenger seat. He was not driving. So there were the logistics of a wheelchair in and out of the vehicle, which he just hated. You know, if we all knew the exact hour in the day, maybe you'd do things differently, and I wouldn't have made him suffer through things. But he just hated going to those appointments. And, you know, inevitably it was raining or it was cold or something else. So even from the handicap parking spot, it's a long way in to where the office is. We're not talking about front door kind of service. So there was that, but I'll tell you that the blessing side of it was, and Shelley mentioned this too, is the long periods of time in the driving to and from appointments and the inevitable waiting, either for a test result or in the room, to have some really raw conversations. You know, some of the time with my dad, it would be me, my mom, and 2 of my siblings. So 5 of us in a room, and then the doctor would open the door and say, "There's no room for me." But, you know, we knew on the most important ones, all of us were going to be there. So there were some, you know, logistical challenges, and maybe I'll just leave it at that.
For caregivers, when they're bringing their loved one to the doctor, a lot of the times that person is going for a reason. They have a lot of issues, things they would like to get answers to, and that person being cared for can fake it till they make it. So that can be very frustrating for caregivers, where the doctor will come in and say, well, they seem fine, or they don't seem confused, or and that's when I would, you know, recommend planning ahead, even if that means you have to call the doctor's nurse ahead of time and say, hey, these are the things we need addressed. And I recommend keeping a notebook, because when you get there, most of the time when you remember what you want to ask is when you're in the car leaving. So having that notebook of those important things that you want covered, and then that way you can jot it down too, and you can look back and say, oh, that's right, we did discuss this. Because again, as these guys can attest, the caregiver is so overwhelmed that it does help just to be prepared before the appointment and just have your little doctor's notebook with you.
Can I add something?
Yes.
I kind of alluded to this before, but we found it not only for continuity, but really important that one of the adult children be there with my mom and dad, not to sit in the waiting room. There was real selective hearing on both their parts, and I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but there was flat out lying told to us about things, and I think when someone is sick, it's so important to have an advocate there, and so, you know, you can kind of be the bad cop where you're leaning and saying, well, you say we need to have this appointment with a specialist, so how do I go about doing that, and who do I call, and can I make that appointment here? And like Shelley, you know, you need someone to lean in. When you're a sick person, you can't always have the strength to do that. So.
And I would like to add quick thank you for adding that, because yes, having an adult child is very helpful to have that extra set of ears, because sometimes too that message you're getting is not one you want to hear. So
I have a different perspective as a parent. My son has a number of doctors, a lot of them specialists. A lot of planning goes into making the appointment. A lot of his specialty doctors you can't get in for 3 to 6 months. And so if you need an ENT appointment, you better make it now for September. So that's one of the challenges that that we have to overcome is being aware of that. Also, we have to be aware of when my son needs labs, what medications could possibly affect the lab results. So then we have to plan ahead of time what medications we have to wean him off of for a short period of time so those labs aren't messed up. I also have to plan around, do I have a home health nurse available that day? What time does the home health nurse have to be back by? Because she potentially has kiddos to pick up as well. And she has her life and stuff afterwards, so she wouldn't be able to stay much after her shift. So a lot of planning goes behind actually making an appointment. The day of the appointment is also a lot of work. My son requires a lot of respiratory therapies just to have a good quality of life, to be able to breathe. And so we have a lot of caregiving activities, physical activities that we have to do in the morning to take care of him. Then we have to get his chair ready. We have to pack up all of his supplies. We have a backpack that's full of all of the materials that we would need in case an event were to happen where he would stop breathing. We have backup supplies in case a piece of equipment breaks or malfunctions. We have a spare ventilator. We have a suction machine. We have oxygen, his normal diaper bag with extra clothing. And it's a lot. So it's him, it's a foldable wagon that's full to the brim of just basic life-sustaining machinery to be able to get him out of the house. And that's even if we're going to take him a quarter mile down the road or to the Twin Cities. He needs that much equipment with him at all times because an emergency can happen when you're least expecting it. Also, I always need to have a home health nurse with me. I can't drive by myself with him because I can't be driving and then him have a health emergency. I'm not able to drive and keep my eye on the road and keep my eye on him because how our van is set up, he is in the back. I need to add that I'm very fortunate that we do have a van, and I know that a lot of families don't have that privilege. It's very challenging transportation for families with kiddos in for families with kiddos in wheelchairs. It's very expensive to have a wheelchair or a handicap vehicle. And so just for those families, it would be really hard. Also, another layer of planning for appointments to set up the transportation to get to the appointments. So that's just another thing that those families have to keep in mind. To be eligible for the program, also, it's a lot of paperwork. And I don't know if that's another question, but it's really hard. It's really hard to get services sometimes because we're constantly having to prove that we're in need of the service. And it's like that for basically everything. So it's just a lot of time is spent on the phone and talking to social workers, and they're all doing their job. We don't want anyone to get services who doesn't need them, but it makes it really hard for the families who do need services. It's just more work. It's very overwhelming. You just want to take your child to the doctor, and it's a lot of work.
Definitely. I think the one issue that I would probably raise, the one episode that was the worst, my mom had to go to the hospital. We had to call an ambulance because she fell. Her pain was not in control. The medications were in the process of being changed. And there are all these regulations about what things will get covered and what things won't. And my dad was dealing with the insurance. He was doing a great job. I mean, he'd get like a bill for $60,000 Like, your insurance isn't going to pay this. It's on you. And then he'd get it figured out. But like the panic of that, you know? So I printed out all these regulations about when they can check out somebody and when they have to cover it. And hospice, for example, my whole life I thought like, oh, hospice is covered by Medicare, it's covered by your insurance. Well, it is, but not the housing. So they will pay for the service of hospice, but if you, like my mother, needed to be in a nursing home, you have to pay that $350 a day or $400 a day. So those were the kinds of things we were dealing with. And pain management, if the pain is not under control, insurance, Medicare, they have to keep you until it is. And they released my mom the next day when she was still getting injections in a port. And anyways, her pain was not under control, and they knew that. They sent her home. She ended up being re-hospitalized the same day, and that is a big deal. In a hospital, if you discharge someone and they come back within 24 hours, you did something wrong. So having to fight to say her pain is not under control, she's not leaving, because they just wanted to send her out. And same when she was in the nursing home. It's like, well, they just wanted her to be checked out or for us to pay the $400 a day. It was just this constant battle. And when your parent is suffering and in pain, it's really hard because you aren't used to seeing your parents be weak, I guess is how I would think of it, or need your help in that kind of way. So it's a really vulnerable thing to go through. And that constant like, well, you said this, but here's a paper I have that says you're wrong. And then them going, okay, I guess we'll keep her another day. You know, why would you have to do that? Why would a child of somebody suffering have to do that to get the care that they need and are entitled to? So those were some of the worst moments. And I have to say, by and large, the doctors were very, very good. But, and even the ones who weren't were probably doing the best they could with the information they had at the time. So, and try to show them some grace. The other thing is, this was shortly after all the George Floyd, the protests, everything that had happened in the metro, and my mom was going to Abbott Northwestern. And so she was scared every time because there were like National Guard out in front of the hospital and the buildings were boarded up. And every time there was a court hearing, they were afraid there was going to be episodes. So they would send out police. And ultimately, she was able to do her treatment in River Falls. Abbott lets you get your chemo there. So that helped quite a bit. But that was a crazy time. You know, it's a pandemic and their buildings are burning. And my mom is like a small town girl. She feels like she's, you know, there's just so many episodes like that. And I did keep a Caring Bridge site. I don't know if any of you have done that, but that's kind of where I got to pound it out, and that felt really good.
We do have a question from the audience, which ties in with one of the ones that we wanted to ask you. Our question is, how does caregiving affect other relationships in your life? And then from the audience, specifically Roberta, how do you make sure that your daughter's needs are also taken care of, knowing that that's something that parents sometimes struggle with?
Other relationships in my family. My siblings are as assertive as I am, and sometimes they will say things like, you shouldn't be doing that much for your daughter, for your grandchild. And I basically say, if it looks like I'm suffering, you've misunderstood, because every moment with this child is a joy, as well as my other one. So it's what I love to do, and frankly, I diapered all of them, so I'm not going to take any crap from them. So.
That's a really good question, and it's been really important for me to make sure that my daughter's schedule is pretty non-affected by my son. He was born when she was in preschool, and he had his tracheostomy surgery when she was in the kindergarten. She has not missed any school because of her brother. And so I've been able to keep her schedule pretty consistent. It is challenging because sometimes I'm not able to drive her to her friend's house or sporting events now that she's in middle school. It's a lot more challenging to coordinate who's going to stay home with our son, especially for the afternoon and evening activities when we don't have nursing. So it is challenging, but I always try to make sure that her schedule is pretty non-affected. I also try to make sure that she is not responsible for taking care of her brother. I do have her. She is responsible for household chores because she's part of the family too, and that's just expected. She is expected to keep an eye on her brother so I can go to the bathroom or take a break out in the patio for a few minutes when I feel like I want to scream, because that's what older sisters are expected to do in any other family. But I don't expect her to have to do any of the medical things with him. Also, being a caregiver and having a special needs child in the home, it's really hard because we always, not always, but the vast majority of the day and night, we have somebody else in our home. And I don't want to sound like I'm complaining because a lot of parents desperately need home health nursing. There's a shortage, and I know we're going to touch on this, but there's a shortage of home health nurses, especially in pediatrics. And so I'm very fortunate that I have a nurses. Very, very, very fortunate to have nurses that I trust with my child's life. But they get to see me in my best days and my worst days. It makes it really challenging to have an intimate relationship with my husband because there's somebody always there.
Wow. For my family, there were a few people who love my mom dearly who were very angry that she had decided to quit treatment. Even though that was what her doctors recommended and they hadn't been through what we had seen. I spent a lot of nights, my mom had a hospital bed in the living room and I would sleep on the couch because her medication has to be given out in these times of the night and she can't get up and do it herself. So somebody has to set an alarm and sleep on the couch. And they weren't like participating in any of that and really didn't do any of their own homework and understand how devastating and how quick this disease is. Her second chemo, she had a seizure during chemo. And it was just me and this lovely pastor who just decided to walk through and be there to support people, walked in the room and she had a seizure. And I was like, you need to hold her down. I'm going to get help. And that was the kind of stuff that was happening. And people were not understanding that for her, I'm just going to let that go. Okay. Is that a video game or is that the beer? It's the beer. Okay, good. So that was really hard. And the chemo, she got severe a UTI, urinary tract infection, that caused severe dementia, high fevers. I mean, chemo is a lifesaver for many, many people. And for some, it's just not. And we went through that with her. I mean, we were sitting on the floor with her when the ambulance came to get her. And if you're not there, if you're not doing that, if you haven't done the research, and then you question the family's and ultimately my mom's decision, that was hard. And I I had to exercise restraint I don't normally have to make sure that those relationships would stay intact after my mom died, because those people mean a lot to me, and I didn't want that to affect the way we would interact for the rest of our lives.
We are getting close to 7 o'clock, so if the audience has any other questions, feel free to give them to Matt now. Otherwise, I think we have one final question, and while you guys answer that, if you have anything else, any closing statements you would like to make, feel free to do so. We have an aging population who are living longer but not independently. We have children born with complex medical issues who need long-term or even lifelong care. So what can people in the Valley do, formally or informally, to ensure that our society can provide that quality care?
I'll be as direct about this as I have on other things. We need to vote for people who believe in public health, period. At the county level, at the state level, we just have to vote for people who don't get involved in magical thinking and who believe in science. I think that, the second point that I would make is when it comes to an aging population, we need to think about ourselves. I mean, I've been retired for a few years. I want to give advice to anyone who's like me or older. Try to make your next move before you have to. Before you have to. My dad in particular was waiting for something to happen before he would do what was obvious, and that is that he needed to sell his remote lake home and move somewhere closer to medical care. And make your next move before you have to. It's smarter financially, you'll be happier, and your kids will have less stress.
You always give me such great segues. I'm glad you're sitting next to me. So what I always like to discuss with caregivers is you never want to plan in an emergency. So just like you said, or when there's a catastrophic event where something happens where now the decision's made for you. So to have those conversations early, what do you want aging to look like for you? And I would really encourage anyone, if you haven't reached out to your local Aging and Disability Resource Center, that's what we do. We're there for you to ask questions, find resources. We're not there to tell you what to do. We're there to meet you where you are at and just make sure that you have that tool in your toolbox for when you need it, because you can never be too prepared.
I was also going to say vote, because politicians are the ones who are making decisions that are affecting the quality of care that our loved ones are getting. My son gets Medicaid, and I'm very grateful for that service. But the politicians are also determining how much money our home health nurses are getting paid, and it's not very much. I'm very fortunate that they've decided to go into home health, but a lot of nurses are deciding to work in the hospital because they're getting reimbursed a lot more, like triple or quadruple the amount. And if they're going into travel nursing, sometimes that's a lot more. And so that's all in the government's hands, unfortunately. Another thing that we can do is just simply be a kind person. I know that it seems so straightforward, but if you see a family who is struggling, instead of just asking you could just straight up ask, what can we do to help you? But I know from personal experience that chances are that person is going to say nothing. You don't need to do anything. But sometimes it's just nice for somebody to randomly make that meal or mow the lawn or just do something nice and kind. It helps a whole lot. And maybe it seems like something small, but it really helps to energize the soul. And it's something, when I think back on my journey as a mom, I still remember those little things that people have done for us in our darkest moments, and a lot of people don't always understand at the moment how meaningful it is, but it really is. I'd like to thank everyone for this opportunity to be here, and I just really want everyone to know that you're not alone in your caregiving journey. I've struggled a lot in my caregiving journey. I've experienced all range of emotions. And I'm finally at that point where I feel like I can support other caregivers. And so I just wanted to put in the plug for my own ministry at Cedar Brook Church in Menominee, Wisconsin. I've started a support group for caregivers as well as ministry. And so you can call Cedar Brook Church in Menominee and they can give you the information about the group and the ministry as well. It's open to all caregivers, not just parents, all caregivers. I think a lot of caregiving falls to the females because that's in our nature. But there are male caregivers out there. We see you too. You're not alone. And I have that ministry to support you in your caregiving journey.
That's a really important thing you're doing. Thank you. They touched on the sort of public policy aspects, and so I guess I would say reiterate what you've said about sort of those random acts of kindness, because wow, those stick with you. And people who just brought over gift cards for food or gas and just turned on the lawnmower and suddenly we're in my parents' backyard, mowing the lawn. And my parents didn't ask for that. They just came over and did it. People around here are extraordinary and they make wonderful offers, and people are hesitant to reach out and accept those offers. So sometimes to be a little gently assertive, like, no, I mean it. I really want to come over and I will help you with whatever if is. Those are the moments that you will remember, that person who's in need will remember for years and maybe forever. And that's what, for me, literally carried me and my family through all of that, because that is just such a wonderful, generous, loving thing to do, to offer a small kindness to somebody that maybe you don't even know that well. So that's how I would wrap it up.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for coming and listening to our panelists. Thank you for watching at home, whether it's live or by replay. We will have a link up on the Hudson Library Facebook page. And a special thanks to our panelists for coming in and sharing their stories. Carrie, Tara, Roberta, Shelley. And we were lucky enough that Kerry brought in the perfect quote to shut out this Voices in the Valley. As Rosalind Carter once said, there are only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need a caregiver. Thank you all so much.